What if I told you that the most luxurious weddings of the last century were actually lavish funerals for living souls? We are accustomed to admiring black and white photographs of ladies in diamond tiaras, envying their wealth and carefree lifestyle. But behind the facades of the majestic mansions of New York and London lay a frightening emptiness that could not be filled with gold or titles. These women had the power to change the interiors of palaces, but they did not have the right to choose their own destiny or even what to wear for breakfast. Their lives were scheduled down to the minute by strict etiquette, turning every day into an endless performance for an indifferent audience. History remembers them as style icons and queens of high society, but remains silent about how many tears were absorbed by the velvet cushions of their sofas. Watch the video to the end to find out how the golden cage broke the will of the strongest women of the era, turning them into silent decorations in their own living rooms. Are you ready to learn the truth about how marriages that newspapers called unions made in heaven were actually arranged? In the Gilded Age and late Victorian era, love was an unaffordable luxury, accessible only to the poor who had nothing to lose. For the elite, marriage was purely a commercial transaction where feelings and affection carried absolutely no weight in the balance of benefits. Parents viewed their daughters as valuable assets that needed to be invested with maximum profit for the family's reputation. From an early age, girls were prepared for their sole function to become a profitable match for a man with the right surname and bank account. No one asked the young lady if she liked her future husband, because her opinion was considered an unimportant whim, unworthy of the attention of serious people. Often the groom was much older, had a bad temper or questionable habits, but this paled in comparison to the glamour of his title or the size of his fortune. The wedding ceremony turned into a grand demonstration of the power of two clans, where the bride played the role of a precious trophy. Newspapers described in detail the cost of the lace on her dress and the weight of the pearls around her neck, but remained silent about the coldness in her eyes. It was a performance where every guest knew their role, and no one dared to break the script with genuine emotion. After the lavish celebration, the doors slammed shut, and the young woman found herself alone with a stranger in a huge empty house. Romantic dreams drawn from books were shattered by the harsh reality of marital duty and cold alienation. She understood that she had been sold, albeit for a very high price, into slavery to social conventions. The family's wealth did not give her freedom, but on the contrary, imposed heavy shackles of obligations that could not be thrown off without scandal. The woman became a hostage to the expectations of society, which demanded perfection from her in every gesture and glance. Any attempt to show character or disagreement was brutally suppressed not only by her husband, but also by her own relatives. History knows many examples when brilliant marriages turned into years of quiet despair behind the closed curtains of luxurious bedrooms. We see only formal portraits with calm faces, but we do not hear the silent cry frozen in their eyes. It would be very interesting to know your point of view. Do you think that financial well-being can compensate for the lack of love and freedom? Write about it in the comments. What if I told you that hundreds of American girls were literally traded for coats of arms and castles in need of repair? At the end of the 19th century, a unique and tragic phenomenon emerged known as dollar princesses. American industrial magnates who had amassed huge fortunes in railroads and steel dreamed of entering high society, but the doors of the old aristocracy were closed to them. At the same time, British lords and dukes sat in their crumbling estates, possessing grand titles but empty wallets. Thus was born a cynical market where the youth and money of the New World were exchanged for the ancient titles of the Old World. The mothers of American heiresses went on a veritable hunt for ruined European aristocrats, seeing them as a ticket to high society. The girls were transported across the ocean like expensive goods destined for export, with no regard for whether they wanted to leave their homes. They were told that becoming a duchess or countess was a woman's highest calling, for which any hardship could be endured. However, the reality they faced in England was far from the fairy tale notions of life at court. Instead of warm and cozy American homes, they were greeted by huge, drafty castles without heating or running water. The British aristocracy, which gladly accepted American dollars, often treated the princesses themselves with contempt. They were considered vulgar, too loud, and not well-mannered, and were constantly reminded of their lowly origins. Their husbands, having gained access to their dowries, quickly lost interest in their wives, returning to their old habits, clubs, and mistresses. These women found themselves in a foreign country, surrounded by people who saw them as nothing more than walking checkbooks. Their money went to repair the roofs of family estates, pay their husbands' card debts, and maintain a huge staff of servants. At the same time, they often had no right to dispose of their own funds, being completely dependent on their spouses. Even the birth of heirs did not bring relief, as children were often immediately taken away by nannies, raised in English traditions and alienated from their mothers. The dollar princesses remained only a beautiful decoration in the history of ancient families, their names erased, leaving only the restored walls of castles. In the next chapter, you will learn why even the most ordinary day for these women turned into an exhausting marathon of changing clothes. Guess how long it took just to get ready for morning tea? The life of a society lady of that era may seem idle to us, but in fact, she was subject to a grueling schedule that left her no free time. Every day turned into an endless ritual of changing outfits, where each dress had to strictly correspond to the time of day and the occasion. A woman could not simply wear what she liked. She was obliged to follow a complex code, the violation of which threatened social ostracism. The morning began with the help of a maid, as it was physically impossible to put on a complex outfit on her own. Lacing the corset, numerous petticoats, stockings, fasteners. All this took hours and required the patience of a statue. After breakfast, she had to change for a walk, then for visits, then for tea, and finally the most luxurious outfit for dinner. Etiquette dictated not only what to wear, but also what to talk about, how to sit, who to smile at, and who to ignore. Any display of naturalness, loud laughter, or overly lively gestures could cause gossip and condemnation. A woman had to be a perfect doll, devoid of fatigue and bad moods, always ready to adorn the living room. The duty of visiting was hard work. It was necessary to visit dozens of houses, leave business cards, and exchange empty phrases with people who were often unpleasant. It was an endless Vanity Fair, where everyone evaluated everyone else, and the slightest mistake was remembered for a long time. The intellectual life of women was strictly limited. Reading serious books was not encouraged, and discussing politics was considered bad form. They were taught to play music, embroider, and speak French, but only to entertain guests. Intelligence and education could even scare off potential suitors or irritate a husband who did not tolerate competition. In this system, women had no right to personal time or privacy. They were always on display, under the gaze of hundreds of eyes. Even in their own bedrooms, they were not in charge. The schedule of the house was dictated by servants and managers. The feeling that you were not living your own life, but playing a role in an endless play, drove many women mad. Behind the glitz of balls and receptions lay a profound lack of freedom that turned a luxurious life into a gilded cage. They were prisoners of their status, shackled in silk and velvet, deprived of the right to a simple human, "I want." If you like this description of the hidden side of luxury life, please like this video. What if I told you that the houses themselves were designed to ensure that spouses saw each other as little as possible? The mansions of the Gilded Age and Victorian estates are impressive in their scale and splendor, but their layout was designed not for comfort, but for separation. The architecture worked to erect invisible but solid walls between husband and wife, cementing their alienation. Huge spaces, long corridors, and enfilades of rooms created a physical distance that was difficult to overcome. There were clearly delineated male and female halves of the house, where members of the opposite sex were not exactly forbidden to enter, but were not welcome without a special reason. The men's territory included a study, a library, a billiard room, and a smoking room, places where the master could spend whole days. There, business matters were decided, political discussions were held, and deals were made to which women were denied access. It was a world of leather, dark wood, and cigar smoke, securely isolated from the rest of the house. The women's quarters, The boudoir, morning room and bedroom, were a realm of soft fabrics, pastel colors, and silence. Here, the mistress of the house spent her hours writing letters, doing needlework, or simply gazing out the window. These spaces were designed as a golden cage within a golden cage, a cozy prison with soft walls. Even the spouse's bedrooms were often located at opposite ends of the corridor, or even on different floors, connected only by a formal door that was often locked. Sleeping together was considered a sign of the lower classes, while the aristocracy preferred separate rest, which further widened the emotional gap. Husband and wife mainly met in formal areas, in the dining room at a long table or in the ballroom in front of guests. In such an environment, intimate conversation or displays of affection were impossible, and all communication was reduced to a formal exchange of pleasantries. Thus, the architecture itself dictated the style of relationships: cold, distant, formal, and devoid of emotional intimacy. The walls designed to protect the family actually divided it, turning loved ones into neighbors in the palace. In the next chapter, you will learn how icy silence became the main inhabitant of these luxurious bedrooms. Marriage in high society often resembled the work of two diplomats representing different powers who were forced to coexist in the same territory. Not only was there no emotional connection between spouses, it was often not even expected in the first place. Men of that era lived a rich external life: clubs, horse racing, parliament, business, and travel. Women remained the guardians of the hearth, where the fire had long since gone out, awaiting the return of their husbands as rare guests. Conversations at dinner often boiled down to discussing plans for the season, bills, or the behavior of servants, without touching on deeper feelings. Sincerity was frightening. Showing feelings was considered a weakness, and tears were considered hysterical and unworthy of a lady. Women learned to wear a mask of calm, hiding behind it a storm of unspoken grievances and disappointments. Husbands often had parallel lives which their wives knew about, but were obliged to keep quiet about in order to maintain the appearance of propriety. It was considered normal for a man to have a mistress, almost an obligatory attribute of status, while absolute fidelity was required of a wife. This dual position humiliated women, making them feel inferior and replaceable. She could not make any claims, cause a scene, or demand respect, as she was financially and socially dependent. All she could do was pretend not to notice anything and smile at her rivals at social gatherings. This required tremendous self-control and gradually killed all her feelings. Children who could have been an outlet were often raised by a staff of nannies and governesses, seeing their parents only at strictly designated times. Motherhood was also regulated. Emotional attachment to children was considered vulgar and was not encouraged. Women found themselves in a vacuum, with no one to give their affection to and no one to receive warmth from. Evenings spent alone by the fireplace in a huge living room became a symbol of her existence. Books, embroidery, playing solitaire. That was the entire range of entertainment for the mind and heart. The silence in the house was so thick that it seemed you could cut it with a knife. Even when the couple was in the same room, they could be infinitely distant from each other, immersed in their own thoughts. Between them stood a wall of unspoken words, mutual reproaches, and indifference, which only grew thicker over the years. The lack of emotional intimacy led women to live in a world of illusions and fantasies. They idealized the heroes of novels, dreamed of the impossible, and drifted further and further away from reality. It was a special kind of loneliness. Loneliness in plain sight, among crowds of guests and sparkling chandeliers. The worst thing about it was that it was a life sentence that could not be appealed. A woman withered like a flower without water, retaining her outer beauty but losing her inner light and desire to live. Are you ready to learn the truth about why people in those days so often fainted and suffered from mysterious nervous disorders? The epidemic of women's diseases in the Victorian era and the Gilded Age was a direct consequence of a lifestyle that suppressed personality and physiology. Tight corsets, which deformed internal organs and made breathing difficult, were not the only cause of constant malaise. The main factor was deep psychological exhaustion from the inability to be oneself and the constant pressure of social constraints. Doctors of the time came up with a convenient diagnosis: neurasthenia, or simply weak nerves, attributing everything to the natural fragility of the female body. In reality, it was the psyche's reaction to life in a golden cage, to the lack of purpose and activity. Depression, anxiety, panic attacks. All of this was hidden under the noble terms spleen or melancholy. The treatment offered by medicine was often worse than the disease itself and resembled sophisticated torture. The famous rest regimen prescribed that a woman lie in bed for weeks in a darkened room without books, communication, or any activity. It was believed that mental activity was harmful to the female brain, and complete inactivity would help restore strength. Such treatment often brought patients to the brink of insanity, forcing them to stare at wallpaper patterns for hours on end. Instead of help, they received even greater isolation, left alone with their dark thoughts and fears. It was a way to completely break a woman's will, turning her into a submissive, apathetic creature. Various tonics and elixirs containing opium, laudanum, or cocaine were widely used and sold freely in pharmacies. Women were literally hooked on drugs to make them calm, comfortable, and trouble-free. Addiction became another invisible chain that kept them in a state of semi-consciousness. Fainting, which became a cultural cliché of the era, was often the only legal way to express protest or avoid an unpleasant situation. When emotions overflowed and screaming was not allowed, the body shut down, giving a temporary respite. It was a silent cry for help that no one really wanted to hear. Migraines, which became a constant companion of society, ladies, were the result of constant tension and wearing heavy hats and hairstyles. Pain became an excuse to lock yourself in your room and be alone for a while, without a mask. Hypochondria flourished, as illness gave women at least some status and attention from those around them. Being fragile and sickly even became fashionable, emphasizing aristocratic and refined nature. Behind these diagnoses lay broken destinies, unrealized talents, and suppressed energy. A healthy, active woman was perceived as an anomaly that did not fit into the ideal of a domestic angel. Medicine at that time served as an instrument of patriarchal control, reinforcing the myth of female weakness and inferiority. In the next chapter, you will learn what was hidden behind doors that even the closest friends were not allowed to enter. Life in a luxurious mansion meant a complete loss of privacy, something we don't even think about today. A wealthy lady was never truly alone. She was surrounded by an army of servants who witnessed her every move. The maid knew everything about her health and mood. The footman overheard snippets of conversation, and the coachman knew where she was going and to whom. Servants were invisible observers who nevertheless wielded enormous power, the power of information. Gossip spread incredibly quickly among the servants, and the secrets of the master's bedroom became known to the entire staff and then to the neighboring houses. The feeling of being constantly watched created an atmosphere of paranoia and restraint. A woman could not simply relax, cry, or lose her temper. She always had to keep up appearances in front of the servants. Losing authority in the eyes of the servants was unacceptable, as it threatened to throw the household into chaos. Therefore, even in the most difficult moments, she was forced to play the role of a calm and authoritative mistress. Letters that came and went from the house passed through many hands, and there was no guarantee that they would not be read. Personal diaries had to be kept under lock and key, and important conversations had to be whispered behind tightly closed doors. Trust was in short supply, and even one's own chambermaid could be suspected of espionage. In large houses, there was a complex hierarchy of servants, and the mistress had to skillfully maneuver between their intrigues and grievances. This required diplomatic skills and constant attention, taking a toll on her mental energy. The mistress's daily habits, tastes, and whims were discussed in the servants' quarters, becoming the subject of ridicule or condemnation. She was an object of study, like an exotic butterfly under glass, deprived of the right to privacy. The inability to simply go into the kitchen and make herself a cup of tea created a dependence on other people for the simplest things. Any action required calling a servant, giving an order, and waiting for it to be carried out, which deprived life of spontaneity. The worst nightmare for a woman of high society was not ruin or death, but public scandal. Reputation was the only capital that mattered, and the slightest blemish on it could ruin a life forever. Society functioned as a strict jury that handed down sentences without the right to appeal or pardon. Any deviation from the norm, whether it was a daring outfit, a careless word, or a glance, was instantly noted and discussed. The fear of what people will say was a powerful tool of control, forcing women to suppress any lively impulses. Life became like walking through a minefield where one wrong step meant social death. Divorce was considered an indelible shame, resorted to only in the most exceptional and tragic cases. Even if her husband was a tyrant, a gambler, or openly unfaithful, a woman had to endure it for the sake of maintaining the appearance of family well-being. A divorced woman automatically became an outcast. She was no longer invited to respectable homes, and old friends turned their backs on her. This forced women to live for years in the hell of domestic violence or psychological pressure, not daring to complain to anyone. Silence was the price they paid for their status, for the right to remain part of the elite circle. Public opinion was ruthless towards victims, often blaming the woman herself for family problems. She couldn't keep it together. She was a bad wife. Newspaper chronicles and gossip columns were weapons of mass destruction. Being mentioned in them in a negative context was tantamount to disaster. Ladies were forced to literally buy the silence of journalists or behave as quietly as possible. Hypocrisy flourished. Everyone knew about each other's vices, but pretended that nothing was happening until it became public. The main thing was to observe external propriety, and what happened behind closed doors did not matter. Women became policemen for each other, zealously monitoring compliance with the moral code. Those who suffered from restrictions themselves condemned those who tried to break them with particular cruelty. The fear of condemnation was passed down from mother to daughter, creating generations of women who were afraid of their own shadows. It was a dictatorship of reputation, where happiness was sacrificed for the sake of a good name. The only way to break out of this cycle was to completely sever ties with one's world, which only a few had the courage to do. Most preferred to quietly fade away in their immaculate living rooms, maintaining appearances until the very end. High society life, which from the outside seemed like an endless party, was in fact exhausting work to maintain one's status. The opera, the theater, balls, these were not places of entertainment, but battlefields for influence and recognition. A woman in a theater box was not a spectator, but the main exhibit on display for all to see. She had to sit up straight, smile, show off her family jewels, and pretend to enjoy the music. No one cared that her corset was digging into her ribs or that her head was splitting from migraines and stuffiness. Her job was to shine, reflecting her husband's success, even if she was filled with dark melancholy inside. The eyes of the entire hall were fixed on the boxes. Who came with whom, how they were dressed, who was talking to whom. It was a crossfire of binoculars and lorgnettes from which it was impossible to hide. Any slip-up, any sign of weakness or fatigue instantly became fodder for gossip. Many women remember these evenings as torture, the need to make small talk with empty people, to feign interest in boring topics. Sincere laughter or lively emotion were out of place here. Everything was subject to strict protocol. Returning home in their carriages, they felt emptiness and physical pain from the strain. Taking off their heavy jewelry in front of the mirror, they saw a tired, unhappy woman in the reflection. Not a socialite. The sparkle of diamonds could not hide their dull gaze. But society preferred to look at the stones rather than into their eyes. It was an industry of illusions, where everyone played their part, afraid to admit that the emperor had no clothes. Behind every great socialite was a story of overcoming oneself, a story of daily violence against one's nature. They were actresses in a theater where the curtain never fell and applause was the only reward. When the era of glamour and Victorian primness came to an end, many of these women were left with nothing. Their world, built on rituals and conventions, was crumbling under the onslaught of a new era, leaving them confused. They grew old, having fulfilled their duty to their families, but never knowing what personal happiness was. Many of them lived out their lives in huge empty mansions that had become too expensive and uncomfortable. Children who had grown up in the cold of alienation rarely visited their mothers, continuing the tradition of distance. The loneliness of old age was the logical conclusion to the loneliness of youth, only now without the glamour of balls. They left behind memoirs in which the bitterness of missed opportunities shone through between the lines. Diaries found by their descendants revealed the truth about tears shed into pillows and dreams of escape. But even in these writings, they rarely dared to openly rebel, remaining true to their upbringing. Their portraits hang in museums, but we rarely think about who these women really were. We see velvet and lace, but we do not see the scars on their souls left by the golden bars of their cage. The story of these marriages is a lesson that human dignity and freedom cannot be compensated for by any material goods. They became victims of a system that valued form over substance and status over people. Their silence was their shield and their curse, preventing the world from knowing the depth of their tragedy. They took their secrets to the grave, leaving us only beautiful legends about a wonderful era. Today, looking at the ruins or restored halls of their palaces, we must remember not only the wealth, but also the price that was paid for it. These are monuments not only to luxury, but also to human endurance and the fate of women in a man's world. The legacy of these women is not only antiques, but also a warning that a golden cage remains a cage, even if its bars are decorated with diamonds. Their voices, silenced by etiquette, sound today as a reminder of the value of the freedom to be oneself. We have walked through the corridors of time, peeking behind the scenes of the most glittering facades of the past. What we have seen there forces us to reevaluate our ideas about happiness and success in that era. Luxury, which was supposed to bring joy, often became an instrument of oppression, and marriage became a life sentence. These women lived in a world where they had everything except the most important thing, the right to control their own lives. What do you think about this side of the story of the beautiful life? What other historical topics or eras would you like to see exposed in our next videos? Write your suggestions in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss new journeys into the past.